don't think, as you said, I don't think there's any real clear line. I think it just needs to be, it's almost a kind of borders on the line of policy and science in terms of how much data you feel comfortable with before you end up deciding for a species if you think that a different management structure or spatial management structure is appropriate.
And I guess just follow up for clarification, you said that it's both science and management that we're making that, or science and policy that we're making that decision for apportionment?
Through the chair, Ms. Dressel. So I think for apportionment, because we don't have a clear definition yet as to what the purpose of subarea apportionments is, we know why they're useful from a biological perspective, and we know why they might be useful in terms of management and for allocative reasons. But until we have a definition of what it is, it's hard to know what type of information should be in the decision for a subarea apportionment. So in the case of Curry's question, I think if you went around the table to different SSC members, everyone would have a different threshold as to how much information you each feel is needed before you can make a determination about whether or not there's a certain spatial measure that's needed for a specific stock. So that, in my mind, is kind of where uncertainty and how precautionary you want to be, those questions bleed into, are we talking about science or are we talking about more of a how risk averse or risk tolerant are you?
And I guess, Mike, is your question on this? If not, I've got a follow-up. Okay. And this is just then clarifying because in the presentation in the paper, you've got how's this? In the paper, there was the motion from the council saying the SSC does science. The council will use socioeconomic information in tax setting or management, which I am calling policy. And so that's where I thought the perspective was based on reading the paper. Yesterday, you mentioned that there's some socioeconomic information that's used, but then didn't say more about it. And now it sounds like you're saying that we actually do science and management policy, which could include socio-econ. And so I'm just wondering where you're landing right now.
Through the chair, Ms. Dr. Dressel. So the way that I would look at kind of the reason that these three methods have even come about is because of this interaction between where the SSC or where the SSC has been asked to draw a line in terms of biology and using the best methodological data or information, and the council's ask for more flexibility. So if you look at method B, asking for additional flexibility based on maybe something that the SSC decides to recommend, some level of flexibility that you feel is appropriate, that ask is already considering. If you weren't being asked to provide that additional flexibility, you would be strictly providing the biological data. But now you've been asked to provide additional flexibility, and how much flexibility could certainly be based in science, and it could be a very specific quantitative output. But I think the decision to figure out how to decide on what that flexibility is based on is a little bit blurry.
Thank you. Mike?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. This is also about the gray area. In the paper and 3 times in the PowerPoint, there's the statement, the SSC and the PT should continue to recommend apportionment of ABC using the best biological and methodological information available, while socioeconomic information will continue to be incorporated into TAC decisions at the AP and the council. And my question is this, what socioeconomic information is currently being used in the TAC decision-making process at the AP and the council? In other words, is socioeconomic information regularly being provided to the AP and the council to support decision-making at that time? And if so, what analytic products are they using at the AP and the council?
Through the chair, Dr. Downs. So I think, and I know the SSC has talked a lot about this and had an agenda item planned for this, but we don't have the fortune of having that at this time. So the AP and the council have several different resources that are available to them in these decisions, but they don't all necessarily get presented to the AP. They don't all necessarily get presented to the council, especially right during the harvest specifications process. In terms of social and economic information that has come throughout this process, we have the ESRs include some of that, the ESPs include some of that, ASEPO, the econ safes, but in terms of that having all of that information and the right time frame of information for harvest specifications, it doesn't line up exactly. The other information that the AP and the council does get in December, I guess just the council, the AP doesn't receive it, but the in-season management report is provided in December, and that provides a little bit more of a picture of what has been occurring in the fisheries. So that can be useful and informative for harvest specifications. But then beyond those products, the council and the AP regularly receive information from public testimony as well.
Yep, thanks.
So I've got a question from Jason and then me. That's what I see. Oh, and then Dana.
Thanks, Sarah. I just want to make sure I'm clear on method A. So my read of it is that method for stocks where the SSC felt that there was no spatial concern or component in it, that would basically change the process we're in now so that, or maybe it wouldn't, maybe the council will make a recommendation that so the process we have now is the plan teams basically and the authors come up with the methodology to do that apportionment. And so under method A, if I'm reading this correctly, that could go away in certain situations if the SSC felt there wasn't biological reasons for spatial apportionment. I guess I'm wondering what replaces that. What does that look like? Maybe if you have any thoughts on that.
Through the chair, Dr. Gasper. So I don't think that there's no assumption that that information would necessarily go away. I think that information is extremely helpful, it's extremely helpful even in tax setting, even if there is not necessarily a specific sub-area apportionment that is being used and is in the harvest specifications table. So having that biological information, knowing what is coming out of surveys or what is coming out of for tier 6 catch data provides scientific information that the council can use in deciding its sub-area tax. I think the SSC can provide a recommendation on whether or not they feel, if the SSC has a recommendation that that information for a particular stock is not informative, then you would make that recommendation, or the author could provide information to the SSC with which to provide feedback. But just because something is not necessarily falling within the harvest specifications table, I don't think that doesn't mean that there isn't still a benefit of having that information in our SAFE documents, in the plan team report, in the SSC report, and it is useful.
Thanks, Sarah. My question, it's actually a process question, and I've just been in enough conversations that I can't quite remember. So you mentioned that the council has asked for flexibility. And what I'm wondering is, I know from an SSC perspective, we've run into some issues. We've looked at implementing new sort of scientific methodology, realized we were going to be constraining fisheries, and we went to the council for clarity on spatial management policy, and we delayed action in case, the council, to give the council an opportunity. And the part that I wasn't necessarily there for was the council then tasking this discussion paper. And so what I guess I'm wondering is, did this come about, has the council said that they want flexibility in that? Or is this a response to the SSC asking them? And I realize that sounds like a detail, but I'm not sure that I think it actually may be important.
Through the chair, Dr. Dressel, or you are the chair, Dr. Dressel. So in looking at the recent council motion and the SSC's minutes from the past several harvest specifications processes, the SSC had stated where you were having challenges with spatial management policy, et cetera, within this process, and asked the council for feedback, as you said. The council acknowledged in December, that there is a need for more clarification, as well as a need for some type of flexibility. And so they actually did not task a discussion paper, they tasked communication. And so, but the best way, as staff, we felt to communicate was to get everything kind of in writing, since we had a lot of different conversations with a lot of different people. And we're trying to clearly communicate across the board, across all bodies and the public. So there was a back and forth, and then the council responded to some of the issues that they had been hearing from the SSC and from the plan team with this ask of what are the ways that we could potentially provide more flexibility in this process so that we don't have these challenges at most of our harvest specifications.
Thank you very much. Dana.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. I was hoping maybe we could narrow the scope of this a little bit by talking about the fact that it says targeted fish species in the first page there. And I thought this action was mainly coming about from non-target fisheries or non-target species constraining target fisheries. Is that what we're talking about here?
Through the chair, Dr. Hanselman, so in that first part of the paper, the target is a reference to those stocks that are targets in the FMPs. And those are the stocks that you all provide the recommendations for. So I realize there's a difference in the way the FMP defines target versus how we kind of talk about stocks as either being targeted or non-target. So yes, more recently, this has come about because of non-target rockfish stocks. But in the paper, we were trying to acknowledge where the FMP has guidance for, or where it does not have guidance for sub-area apportionments for those stocks that are targets in the groundfish FMPs.
Thanks.
Ian.
Yeah, thanks. It's just a minor clarification on option B. As it's written, it says option B, the flexibility would be expressed as a percentage of the sub-area apportionments, for example, 10 or 20%. I think what's meant there is expressed as a percent of the total apportionment. Because I'm just imagining a case where only 1% goes to some area and 100% change in that would be still nothing.
Through the chair, Dr. Stewart, I think that's a good clarification. I also think that those are just examples. There could be much more complicated methods with which to recommend how to provide flexibility for the apportionments. Yeah.
Great. Brad, and then I've got one too.
Sure. Thank you, Sherry. Before I go, Ian had his hand up. Do you have a follow-up? Okay. Sorry, didn't mean to jump in. Sorry, I had to miss some of the presentation yesterday, and so if this was discussed, just ignore it. But have you had a chance to look at how this apportionment framework is addressed in other regions?
Through the chair, Dr. Harris. I had a conversation with Dr. Free this morning, and we ran out of time, so I'm not going to pretend like I understand how they do it in the Pacific region. And I know that I looked into that at one point, but I clearly didn't look into it enough to remember, so no.
So my question actually is, it may be right a follow-up to Ian's. I also got hung up a little bit on sort of the calculation of the apportionments. How about if I ask, were the bullets on page 4 meant to be specific, or is it specific or explicit, I guess, on the amount of flexibility could be applied, which sort of means to me multiplication versus, and then the resulting quantity would function as, anyway, was the math that was referred to in those sort of explicit or what examples? Because otherwise, yeah, go ahead.
Madam Chair, those are strictly examples, so we really have not fleshed out at all. And I think that would be an appropriate discussion to have, is potentially if method B were kind of a route that the SSC were to recommend, which advisory body and who should kind of come up with that method, that calculation.
Thank you. Back to Ian and then possibly Dana if his hand is still up. Go ahead, Ian.
Thanks. I'm just wondering, in light of our discussions on Monday about the recent executive orders, is this an avenue that we're expecting interest in substantial change in terms of reducing regulation? And or does reducing sub-area apportionments count as reducing regulation?
Through the chair, Dr. Stewart, because these aren't in regulation, I don't know that it would reduce any regulations. And in my discussions with both public and other staff, I have not heard anything related to the EO in terms of this action or related to this action.
And Dana, do you have a question or is that a legacy hand?
I do have another question.
Okay, go ahead.
So when you look at option A, you would expect that such changes would be made sort of permanently. Under option B, I'm wondering if you envision this being a one-off or like a two-cycle kind of change that we would revisit in the following specifications.
Through the chair, Dr. Hanselman, I think both of those, so method A, nothing in this process is necessarily permanent. If there were new scientific information that came to light and we were under method A and the SSC felt that new information provided a different reason for, or a new reason for a certain stock to either have kind of fall in this gray area, or if it needs to be kind of pulled out of this gray area and there's a clear scientific recommendation, then I think that that stock or the method for that stock could certainly be changed. Under method B, that's, in my mind, that's really a question for the SSC and what type of information you would need to see, or what type of information you would need to see a change in before you change how you're calculating the percentage, and whether or not the percentage is consistent across all stocks, whether the percentage is, yeah, I guess consistent across all stocks, or how it's decided. I think the details of that are not worked out yet. So it could change, it could not change. Certainly, we're always looking for efficiencies in this process. So we would probably try to strike a balance of finding a way to increase efficiency in the harvest specifications process while making sure that we're looking at the scientific information that you all have.
Thanks.
Bob.
Yeah, thanks, Madam Chair. Thanks, Sarah. During your presentation, you reminded us of the December council comments about or directives not to include no fishery impact considerations. I don't have the exact language, so I think you know what I mean, right? How would you characterize localized depletion? Is that something that we characterize under that umbrella? I could see us calling that a conservation concern or falling under fishery impact considerations, but it clearly is a rationale in both potential methods that could play out, if you will.
Through the chair, Dr. Foy, I think recently we've really been thinking about localized depletion from a biological perspective. There's certainly a question of how are you getting specific information on localized depletion? Are you getting it through fishery data? Are you getting it through fishery independent data? But at other points in this process, when there is fishery data or data coming from the fishery that's still related to the health of the stock, for example, in the fishery performance category in the risk tables, that has generally still fallen under that biological side for the SSC's consideration.
Mike.
Hey, Sarah, just a quick follow-up. The question I asked earlier, thank you for your thoughtful answer on that, by the way. One thing I want to pick up on, though, it's something you said at the end in terms of basically in thinking about what is the best scientific information available in the socioeconomic realm, as well as the stock assessment, fisheries, science realm. You mentioned public testimony. Well, public testimony is crucial to this process in many different ways, both on from like local knowledge on the water industry input, and also asking people about their particular situation in their community. My question is, you weren't equating public testimony with best scientific information available either in the biology realm or the socioeconomic realm, were you?
Through the chair, no, I think as you captured it, it's just one of the ways that the AP and council receives information, but not in terms of national standard 2 best scientific information available.
Thanks.
Okay. It looks like we're good for questions. Thank you, everybody. Next, we will move to public testimony. And I'll just highlight for the SSC that there is one written comment, and we currently have 3 testifiers signed up. And we will go. The first one is Jim Armstrong.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Been a good follow-up discussion starting this agenda item off, as I was listening to that, some of what I have to say may seem redundant or obvious in light of that discussion, but I'll just go ahead with it anyway. So for the record, Jim Armstrong with the Freezer Long Line Coalition. I'm just offering some brief thoughts on the role of the SSC and the sub-area apportionment of ABCs within the annual harvest specification process. My central recommendation is this: for each stock, before the specification process begins, the SSC needs to explicitly resolve the basis for any existing or proposed sub-area allocations. Specifically, if there is a biological basis for the allocation in whole or in part, or is there a biological basis for the allocation in whole or in part, or is the sub-area allocation purely to achieve management requirements independent of a biological impact? If there is biological justification, such as stock structure or localized depletion risk, then sub-area apportionments function more like like true ABCs, and in those cases, it's appropriate for the SSC to take an active role in reviewing the methodology for calculating sub-area apportionments and the extent to which realized harvest aligns with biological concern. In such cases, these apportionments are directly linked to conservation objectives, and the SSC's scientific oversight is crucial. It seems clear from the discussion that there's still a lot of for the SSC to resolve for this part in terms of the cost to the stock for exceeding sub-area limits. On the other hand, if no biological justification is present and sub-area allocations are simply used to serve spatially explicit management goals, for example, facilitate in-season closures or ease regional or community allocation tensions, then these are much more like sub-area tax, and the SSC should refrain from recommending apportionments. Instead, focus on overall, for these stocks, focus on overall OFL and ABC and allow the council to use allocations as a policy tool in setting tax at the sub-area level. A gray area, though, that does exist with regard to these may still exist. And for example, for those sub-area tax where the basis for the allocation for how the allocation is calculated, for example, the trawl survey may not be well aligned with the distribution of the stock during the fishery. So in those cases, maybe the fishery, if the fishery is 6 months out of phase with the survey and there's it's a fish that moves around a lot, then the SSC could probably step in on that on a technical basis. Excuse me, a technical basis. From a stakeholder standpoint, the distinction between those two kind of major groupings matters. It provides clarity about the SSC's role and for us how to engage in what we all know is a very complicated management process. And we see it, the SSC's role in this issue as being rooted in science and which maintains clarity around what constitutes a true ABC and avoids inadvertently constraining management flexibility based on apportionments that are not grounded in biological concerns. So I've heard that there's some interest in trying to resolve this for the upcoming specification cycle. Based on what I've, just my thoughts about this and the ongoing conversation, I think that might be ill-advised. I think it's going to take at least a couple of reviews. Could probably be done for the fall of 2026. One good example where there's plenty of debate remaining has to do with the biological benefit of ABC-like sub-area apportionments for black-spotted rough-eye, which seems to be the poster fish for this one. But, you know, while throughout the time frame where the area apportionments have been exceeded and concern has been raised, there's been fairly consistent increases in stock biomass, overall stock biomass, which calls into question the biological concern around this one. So that's it for me. I don't know if you have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jim. Just a second, let me pull up our other screen. I don't see any questions. Thank you very much. All right. Sorry, Sarah. I have so many different tabs open at this point. It's not funny. But you are next on the list, aren't you, Sarah Webster? Yes. Thank you. You're welcome to start whenever you're ready.
Good afternoon, chairs and members of the SSC. So my name is Sarah Webster. I'm the Science Projects Director for the Alaska Seafood Cooperative. Our companies participate in numerous fisheries throughout the North Pacific with both target and incidental species that are subject to subarea allocations. We appreciate the clarity and structure of the staff report. I think Ms. Cleaver did a really nice job working on this. It offers a concise summary of a complex issue with some understandable paths forward for refining subarea apportionments. We particularly support the suggestion to revise terminology to better reflect that these apportionments are not true ABCs. One area that we did note needs some further clarification is the scope of applicability of this agenda item. So it's a little bit unclear right now whether the proposed changes are intended to only affect the Gulf rockfish species that were the focus of the paper, or also other species that are critical to some of our operations. So that would include things like POP, BSAI rockfish, mackerel, cod, and sablefish. If these species are subject to revised subarea apportionment practices, they should be given equal consideration in the policy development. Inclusion of some clear examples for additional affected species would improve the accessibility of this report for stakeholders. We do appreciate that the report recognized a critical challenge in spatial management, and that is balancing operational flexibility with biological safeguards. And we generally support initiatives that strive to address those complexities. Overspecifying subarea apportionments, particularly when that's not supported by science, can really unnecessarily constrain fisheries and impede the realization of optimum yield. Many subarea apportionments rely on limited or uncertain scientific data, especially for some of the species that are not well represented in surveys. To this end, we've previously partnered with NOAA and with APU on a cooperative research project to address the spatial mismatch in rockfish data between surveyed and fished areas in the Gulf. And unfortunately, that project is currently paused due to funding shortages. And in addition, we're now hearing that NOAA survey efforts may be further reduced due to both budget and staffing constraints, and that's pretty concerning. The scientific foundation that really is needed to support data-driven decisions is already insufficient in some of these cases, and it looks like it may be deteriorating. Subarea apportionments can also create some operational challenges when target species distributions are misaligned with those of constraining incidental species. So a good example for this in the Western Aleutians for us is with POP, the biomass is currently highest in the Western Aleutians, and yet the incidental catch of black-spotted and rough-eye, which co-occur with POP, is increasingly constraining due to low subarea apportionments. And as Mr. Armstrong mentioned, that is despite evidence of increasing abundance and also lack of genetic stock structure and limited information from surveys due to gear accessibility. That mismatch reduces the fleet's ability to efficiently harvest available and sustainably managed fish. For stocks that are well informed by fishery independent surveys, the current approach of using survey-based apportionments is pretty well understood and generally supported by our members. noting that sometimes the management boundaries are not well aligned with survey stations and stock distributions. They are kind of these made up boundaries that are in there. Stock-specific spatial apportionments should be evaluated on a case-by-case basis and implemented when biologically justified. We, again, strongly support the introduction of clearer, more accurate terminology, referring to these as sub-area apportionments as sub-area ABCs is misleading. These are not thresholds with legal accountability measures. They are policy tools that are informed by science, and they should be labeled as such. And here, the terminology does matter. So that clarity will aid both stakeholder understanding and public transparency. I did mention to Ms. Cleaver that I think she really missed an opportunity here in her ability to come up with some fun acronyms. So I might put forward scientific advice for resource allocations, and you can figure out what that acronym spells and why that's a missed opportunity for her. There you go. So just in closing, the Alaska Seafood Cooperative does remain committed to working with the SSC Council and stakeholders to refine these approaches. We support evidence-based flexible management, and we welcome opportunities to contribute through cooperative research and policy engagement, especially for some of these really data-limited stocks. Thanks for your time. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thanks for your testimony, Sarah. Do we have any questions? Okay, thank you. Next up, we have Mr. Glenn Merrill.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
We're bringing
Thank
new
you.
meaning to sharing this among co-chairs.
Members of the SSC, I'll be brief in interest of your long time that you've spent on this. I think one thing that I did want to highlight, though, and I think Sarah got to this point, but is a challenge that's faced somewhat in your consideration about do you or do you not consider socioeconomic information in sort of this context of how do you handle these gray area stocks where you don't necessarily have clear stock structure. And I think one thing that perhaps is important for you to think about and would be critical in any kind of consideration about broad flexibility about how you set these sub-area limitations would be whether or not there are regulatory constraints that exist within our fishery constructs that would somehow preclude the ability of a fishery to be operational or to realize its ability to be prosecuted. Is that socioeconomic information? Can you consider that as an SSC? I think that might be somewhat of an open question, but I do think you can imagine a scenario like this. You have stock X, and stock X does not have a clear stock structure. It could be harvested in any of the 3 areas that it's currently apportioned to. There's a decision made to apportion a large amount of that, either by using a weighted survey average, which is kind of the general coin of the realm at the moment, or some other methodology. That could result, because of regulatory constraints that exist in one or more fisheries, in an inability for some fisheries in some areas to be able to be prosecuted. That seems to be something that you would want to think about in terms of a recommendation, or if that would be baked into a recommendation that comes from the plan team and then goes through the SSC and then is presented to the council. Would there be an opportunity for the council to change that recommendation? I think in that scenario, you're kind of looking at something that your best scientific information available is telling you there isn't stock structure. You could broadly distribute this stock, and yet at the same time, you make a recommendation on an apportionment methodology that effectively constrains a fishery from being able to be harvested, even though the best scientific information available tells you that you don't have to be so limiting in that particular area. So I think there's that nuance between thinking about the regulatory framework that we operate under, these highly complicated catch share programs, and then how that interfaces with your decisions on these apportionments. I think best practices are helpful for us as an industry when we think about these issues, because we do generally use the weighted average as a decent methodology to both provide an understanding about how that stock can be distributed, our harvest opportunities that exist, but it's also an objective measure. And so I think to some extent helps to avoid some of the complexities that can be introduced if it's a, if you will, free for all every single specs process to determine what that appropriate apportionment would be. Thanks for your time.
I have one question. So I guess reading into your comment, are you saying indirectly that you think we have some species that are currently apportioned that don't have a basis in biology?
Through the chair, Dr. Stewart, I think what I'm saying is that there are distributions that are made for stocks among each of the subareas using a weighted survey average. That's a biological indication of the abundance of that stock in that area. But I think that there are also a number of those stocks for which there is not a strong stock structure, indicating that it would have to be apportioned based on that weighted survey average for that given stock. And then my follow-up to that would be, however, if you differ very substantially from that, depending on the species and the fisheries and the regulations associated with that, you can, if you go too far away from that particular methodology, perhaps inadvertently create challenges with a fishery being able to be prosecuted. Sort of the opposite of, it's the flip side of the constraint, which is flexibility is helpful to be able to address situations that may be challenging a fishery. There's the opposite situation as well, which is too much flexibility can constrain a fishery from being able to operate.
Thank you. And see another question here, Dr. Gasper.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about process here. So I heard the second part to this in terms of the council's involvement, and I thought I heard you suggest, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but that so if it was constraining and the SSC considered social economic information and made a recommendation for a sub area that maybe the council didn't necessarily agree with, that there could be a change at that step. Is that what did I hear that correctly? So it was, I guess our recommendation in that context becomes advisory. I'm not sure if that was the intent, so I just want to clarify.
Maybe I'll try this. Let's think of our method A stocks, the stocks where you really have a very clear stock structure. Then I think we all understand that it makes a lot of sense to continue with our status quo approach, which is we want to make sure that we're not creating this disproportionate harvest in areas that are inconsistent with the best available scientific information. I think where it gets tricky is if there is what is the role of, say, a plan team recommendation that says we think you should use this method X, to apportion among these various areas. If the SSC accepts that, can that be changed by the council? That's, I think, an open question. If the idea is, as it currently is, once that's accepted by the SSC, it's not changeable by the council, then we need to be careful in that process, that in that information that's presented to the SSC, that there is a recognition or a consideration of some of the regulatory provisions that could be implicated if you have a certain kind of an apportionment. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thanks. That clarifies it for me.
Okay, seeing no further questions, thank you for testimony. And that wraps up our public testimony. So I will hand back to our actual chair.
Thank you, Ian. All right. For our SSC discussion, I told you all we've got until 4. So my plan would be, it's 3:20 right now. I'd like to take 25 minutes for our discussion. I wouldn't be surprised if we may be in a bit of a quandary after that. So I'd like to leave the last 15 minutes both for sort of resolving what we're going to say at this point with what we can, with help from you all as well as co-chairs, and then as I sort of give a summary, and we can work on that together, but it may take just a little bit. So at the beginning, what I'd like to do is we did meet, and given that we are constrained on time and we may not be able to answer all of this, I'd like to, I spoke with folks, and I'd like to propose a couple of things that I think we can take off of this discussion and then focus on certain ones. And so this is my proposal. SSC can obviously change that, but given time, it was sort of a thought about how to go forward. So anyway, outline sort of what we focus on in the discussion, and then go to the leads, and we'll go through. And the leads know this ahead of time, so I'm not surprising them. So it seems, so of the questions, and I think Sarah, you were going to have a question slide to put up sort of as background. These are some of the questions that were raised in the paper, in the presentation, and she put them on a single slide. So from an SSC perspective, I think it's worth in our minutes to note that it was stated in the paper that sub-area ABCs are not true ABCs. And I think it would be great to acknowledge, yep, we understand, we agree. Then as far as acronyms go, I think it's maybe reasonable to support finding a new acronym, but I would suggest that maybe we don't try to do that in the next 25 minutes. All right, awesome. The next thing, as far as the methods, there were 3 methods to consider. First method was sort of black and white, there's sub-area apportion or not. Second one is there's sort of a gray scale where you can adjust the apportionment. Third one was much more complicated. And in discussing with staff, I think we would need more information in order to have a full discussion of that third option. So I would suggest for now that we say in our minutes, due to time considerations, we did not address this third option, but could take it up if we're given information in the future. One of the things that Sarah did ask us was she was going to look for the SSC and the council to define what we each saw as the benefit or purpose of having sub areas. And so for us, that's from a scientific perspective. What are sub areas used for? And we can see if we can come up with that definition. I think it's worth trying. And then the last piece was she asked us about the spatial management policy. What was our interpretation of that? And often we will go to council staff and ask, can you help us with the interpretation of any council policy? So, but in this, I think, and I realize this is sort of taking a lead role, you guys can all comment on this, but the spatial policy that was written out, I think it may be on the slide, but was also in the paper. I think that we can talk about sort of a definition of that, and this is a little bit of an awkward discussion, but my interpretation of the spatial management policy would be that it has to do with either splitting apart sub-areas or combining sub-areas. You can see if you agree with that. Having data change, so the proportions among sub-areas, the allocations change, that didn't necessarily trigger the spatial management policy in my eyes. If you change a computer program, that doesn't necessarily, so in other words, anything that changes these allocations, the proposal that we have is, I think we're looking for a year ago, timing myself, a year ago, December in 2023, we asked the council for clarity on the spatial management policy. And I guess my suggestion is that we put down our interpretation of it and what we are planning to follow, and then the council can let us know and give us direction. No, that is not what we mean. This is your role. but I think it's worth putting down what our interpretation is, how we plan to go forward. Essentially, this splits up. The methods 1 and 2, whatever we say about those can be used in the future. But the space, how are we going to deal with this fall? And spatial management policy is in play. So the question is, how are we going to follow that? I feel like I did not do that terribly clearly, but I think we can come up with something that says, unless there is more guidance, this is what we will do in the fall. And the example that Sarah provided in the paper and in the presentation was rough-eye rockfish. Tell me black-spotted rough-eye. No. Short-raker. Short-raker is the one that's coming up this fall in the cycle. Essentially, the SSC went to the council and delayed for scientific reasons. And so the question is, how will we address that this fall if there's nothing else? And that, I think, is has to do with the spatial management policy. So the pieces that I think we can look at are the 2 methods, coming up with a definition and purpose of subarea, and coming up with our interpretation of what we would follow unless we have additional guidance from the council on the spatial management policy with, say, a rough-eye situation in the fall. Those are possibly doable, but now that I've taken up 10 of those minutes, who knows? So why don't we go see where we get? I will start out with the discussion with the leads. So Dana, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, thanks, Sherry. And want to thank Sarah for preparing and presenting the report. I will note that the sub-area ABCs are not ABCs and will be furthermore called SARAs in the future. I want to start by saying a central tenet of fishery science is that by default, we should try to spread out harvest and do it in relative proportion to abundance, and particularly when we don't know much about a stock. In terms of the methods, we've been slowly implementing method A for a number of stocks in the GOA over time as fishery issues have arose, and we gathered more data about those stocks. I think a lot of those apportionments were set early on to be precautionary when we didn't know anything. Implementing method B with the specified amounts of flexibility offers a biologically robust and yet flexible approach that tries to balance our scientific uncertainties with operational realities. The methods are actually kind of the 2 of the same. Method A is just the more extreme version of B, and method B is adding guardrails to A. For example, you could say method A is taking 100% from one area and moving it to the other area. I think both methods A and B are therefore suitable for future use. Option C would require more information from the region and council staff, and I'm not going to weigh in on that one. The presenter noted that either of these methods weren't necessarily a permanent change, but they might be used temporarily for a situation. The spatial management policy would not necessarily be invoked, as usually this policy has only been invoked for splitting areas into smaller sub-area apportionments as opposed to combining things or being flexible. Apportionment methods or data definitely don't invoke the spatial management policy, in my opinion. So I think this added flexibility ensures targeted fisheries remain viable without compromising the sustainability of our groundfish stocks. But I do think it should be used judiciously and focused on non-target stocks that have these highly variable survey estimates that can cause our apportionments to greatly fluctuate between surveys. I think if we opened up this flexibility to all targeted stocks, that would create all kinds of complexities for the council, scientists, and managers. Particularly, there have been issues with apportionments for non-target rockfish, and we know why, because they're located in untrawlable habitats, and they just have high CVs to deal with. The SSC recognizes that temporary deviations from strict biomass-based apportionment may not inherently pose biological risk for most of stocks. However, we should ensure this added flexibility are temporary to address fishery constraints and don't cumulatively shift ABC significantly over time towards some favored sub-area. In terms of choosing the amount of flexibility, I think it could be quite high if it's in a one-year situation. Go with short raker is a good example where the F is very low on the short raker normally. So doubling that F in 1 year would not have a significant impact on that stock. And that's all I have for now. And I look forward to what others have to say. Thanks.
Thanks, Dana. And so I'm going to go to the other leads. Yeah, I'll go to the other leads. Franz, you're next.
Yeah, thanks, Dana, for that comprehensive summary and overview. And I honestly don't disagree with any of it. And I don't think I have additional recommendations. And I'm just trying to take through my notes here if you kind of covered all the things that were raised in the questions and that Sherry kind of outlined that we agreed to touch on. I'll just maybe make the point or reiterate the point that I think the SSC in general supports some flexibility in sub area apportionments that on the one hand kind of recognizes the fact that there's conservation habitat considerations that generally warrant a broad spatial distribution of the catches that can just best be achieved through that kind of measure of spatial allocation. However, since for many stocks, stock structure and the level of connectivity among areas is highly uncertain at best, there's no reason not to consider some flexibility when warranted. And there are, I guess I would have to be sort of fleshed out the advantages and disadvantages of a flexible framework. We've heard some concerns about making it too flexible. But it can encompass what we do right now in terms of setting sort of fixed sub-area apportionments or allow for some level of flexibility. And I would add that would require perhaps a bit of guidance from the council for some process through the plan team over a year or two to kind of develop that if we go down that route. And I think I'll just leave it at that. I didn't really have anything new.
Thanks. And next we'll go to Ian.
Yeah, thanks. I don't have much to add either. I guess I would reiterate that Sarah's likely are appropriate. It appears that acronym is stuck already. And it might be helpful for us to note in our discussion that even in the absence of specific concerns, as Franz just said, in order to retain the full biocomplexity of the reproductive potential of these stocks, I think a priori we would encourage some level of apportionment across SARAs. With regard to flexibility, it might be helpful if we could speculate at this point on what types of information we might use to inform our discussions if we go down this road. And two things come to mind for me. The first would be movement across different life history stages, noting that movement can occur at the egg, juvenile, or adult stage. That would be one, the degree of movement would be one source of information. And also historical observed ranges of stock distribution might be another that could inform us. So those would be two pieces of information that we might bring to bear in a discussion if we were to go down this road. The only other, and I certainly agree that, and the only other comment I would have, and I'm not sure, maybe I don't quite understand, or maybe I don't quite agree with Dana, is the delineation between target and non-target stocks. From a purely scientific discussion, I'm not sure how we delineate stock structure, biological stock structure, based on whether the fishery's targeting them or not. So maybe I just need some more clarification there. Thanks.
Thanks, Ian. Let's go to Dana.
Yeah, I think my main point on that was that this seems like this came about because of the fact that some of these Goa rockfish species, for example, are constraining the target fisheries. But I don't feel like we should be opening up the doors of saying, well, we can take any of these stocks out of any area as targets, because it just seems like that could be seriously sort of manipulated and cause localized depletions and things that we don't want to do to our productive stocks.
So I think hey, Brad.
Sorry, Chair, if you were going to make a follow-up point, I was going to bring up a different, follow on to what Ian had to say, so I can stand down.
Great. All I was going to add was just a little context. And so the questions that Sarah has on the board are actually, they all relate to these method 1, method 2. So if there are other things that we want to comment on, we can. But anyway, so I just wanted folks to know. All right, go ahead, Brad.
Thank you. I really appreciated Ian's comments, and I think what I want to say kind of reflects or applies to that as far as a potential structure for thinking about the input we might ask for, as well as maybe some clarification in the language. So I think about these two case study species. Both of them have this sort of characteristic where we have a pretty solid basis in the literature in terms of life history characteristics, longevity, affinity for local structure, and so forth that suggest we've got aggregation and vulnerability, right? And a biological basis to really think about mechanistically why sort of sub-area or local depletion is concerning. But we have another problem, is that substantial observation error because of the samplers that we use. And so it seems to me we should really start to think about this as these two steps in the process. Here's the biological basis, and that's written into this discussion paper, but it's also to some extent conflated with the spatiotemporal data support that we need to operationalize an apportionment. In these instances, we don't even trust, like if you look at the Jones et al. Paper on northerns and duskies, when they went and looked with other means besides the trawl survey, they found 5 to 40 times more fish than were showing up in the trawl survey, and clear indications that large portions of the spatial domain where those fish lived weren't included in the survey data that would have been used to assign the spatial apportionment. So I think we need to think about these in 2 steps. Worst case scenario is we clearly have biological characteristics that tell us we're vulnerable, and we don't have the spatial data support to put a defensible conservation positive apportionment plan in place. And so we want to, I think carefully about those two and make sure we're not sort of conflating them, because it seems like we often start into that space concerned and then kind of forget that we don't actually have the information we need to put the apportionment plan in place. And so maybe that could be helpful as we think about going forward in the conversation, assessing the types of information that we need. And then we could also request that in further iterations of this document, maybe we can separate those two so we get a better understanding of where we might stand.
I think that one of the thoughts, and I think my thought actually follows up with yours, Brad, a bit, and that is, I agree with Dana that, method A is is much more strict implementation than B. B is nuanced. And it sounds like, even from what Ian said, some of the metrics that may define flexibility in method B are degree of movement and range of stock. Knowing that we have limited information on both of those, and Brad also mentioned observation error. My question is, do we think, I know we don't have to necessarily come up with a metric here today. This is something that can be done in the development, but by saying that A and B are both possible, what it says to me is that there's enough information on these factors to make some calculation of what the flexibility should be. And I agree, I think that flexibility is good. For some of these stocks, I don't think it's that we have no conservation concern. We just have less. And so that suggests an intermediate, which is great. It picks up on this flexibility. However, estimating that is tricky. And I'm wondering if we have the the information, reasonable information in order to do B. And if not, and the only reason I really bring it up, because we could figure that out later, but I guess it's a balance between the amount of time it's going to take for development of this approach and for us to discuss this, if it comes up every year, is going to be really high and, or could be really high. And is that amount of time worth it for how certain we are as the percent of flexibility we need? I don't know. So anyway, Curry.
I think I share your concern with method B and defining a rigorous and reproducible way to identify the level of flexibility that we ascribe to a stock. The only way, as I was sort of mulling over this last night, that we might be able to do that is to break our stocks into categories. So beyond kind of the clear conservation concern, if we can come up with a clear definition for, what is the burden of proof for a conservation concern based on life history, based on movement, based on perhaps genetic stock structure, you can separate stocks in that way potentially if we have information. The next question, as Brad brought up, is do we have the information to actually, in a reliable way, develop an apportionment scheme? And for some stocks, maybe yes, maybe no. And so there's almost three categories. We have a conservation concern, and we have the reasonably robust indices coming from a survey passed through a REMA model with sufficiently low CVs to actually do that. You have the intermediate, which is a stock for which we probably have some sort of conservation concern, or we believe we're at risk, but we have insufficient information. And then we have everything else. And one could tie the flexibility to those three levels. But beyond that, it seems like there's potential to spend a lot of time debating what the appropriate level of flexibility is, at the same time having imperfect information to define that.
Mike.
I'm going to suggest that we not include anything on socioeconomic information in this, other than we talked about doing hold on. I know you're amazed. We talked about doing a generic paragraph up near the start of the minute somewhere that said, we reiterate, we still need to have this discussion about products and timing and so on. This is an example of, there's a lot of ambiguity. The council may want to make some calls based on tax considerations in terms of policy. That highlights we should get a systematic socioeconomic plan that can supply that type of information. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mike. Kaylin.
I have a comment, and maybe more semantics, but I heard some of this language and I think questions and then a few comments that people have made. So I guess my recollection is that we ended up having these conversations because there was this idea that fishery flexibility or performance is good, that constraining fisheries is bad. But I don't think that's within the purview of the SSC. And so I guess I would suggest for our minutes that we would say something like, and if people feel like this, that some flexibility in some cases would not be a biological concern. And that we would give the council discretion, so that we wouldn't take that extra step of we support fishery flexibility or fishery performance. We don't find a biological basis, and therefore we find that from a biological perspective, the council could have discretion. And so, does that make sense? And so I mostly agree with Mike, but I would just say, as I was listening, I think we should make sure to strip the social and economic considerations out of our text really explicitly, and it might just take a look through on the notes.
I think that's consistent with our minutes from 2023, which is good. We don't have a conservation concern, and in that case, it was, and there could be, yeah, I won't try to paraphrase it. I think it was consistent. I do realize it's 3:45. This so far isn't completely unruly, so let's go ahead. So I'm gonna just check off and see where we ended up. We've got one of the things that do we think that it is possible to define the purpose or the value of subareas from a biological perspective? I don't think we should do this like historically, like why were they set up? Because there's a lot of history we don't know. But it seems like we can say from a biological perspective, having subareas is having our ABC divided by subareas in approximate proportion to the relative population abundance provides protection for conservation of species, especially that may have some spatial structure. So I would love your interpretation, Brad. I'm just trying to come up with a definition. Oh, yeah. Oh, gosh. I don't know if I can say it again. So I was trying, oh yeah, please write. So the SSC looks at both the purpose or the value of subareas from a biological perspective, and that is dividing the ABC into four stocks where this is already done, dividing ABC into sub areas, and allocating allocating this Sarah ABC by, oh, you're right, we're trying to drop ABC. Dividing the Sarahs, whatever, you understand. Doing spatial allocation among these sub areas in proportion to the relative abundance of the stock, provides protection for species that have a spatial stock structure. I see that as other people can join in, but from a biological perspective, I think that is a benefit. I don't know if that's the only benefit. Curry or Bob, do you have your hands up? I can't quite tell. Curry.
No, I think you hit the nail right on the head. We can say from biological first principles, tying the intensity of harvest to the relative abundance across space makes intuitive sense. Ignoring any of the potential costs that may come in terms of fishery operation, right?
Where were
Purely
you
biological
located?
perspective.
Yes. Okay. Bob.
I agree, as long as we're also capturing the idea that we'll communicate our understanding of the bias in that when at all possible to capture Brad's point.
Is it bias or uncertainty? Because if we knew the bias, we would go ahead, Brad.
To follow up with Bob, I'm speaking about bias. Like the paper I was citing clearly says we are underestimating because we're not detecting, and it flows from there. So Bob's just saying this would be characterized, and I think it's nested right under what Curry said. There's in proportion to the relative abundance as we understand it.
Absolutely.
So we bring that forward to make clear the cases where that uncertainty is very large and such that it's not a conservation positive necessarily. It also gives us a scenario to directly address we have the directed approaches to sub-area apportionment, and then we have the indirect, every spatial closure for stellar sea lions, every process that we use in place to limit where boats can go and what they can catch also produces a sub-area apportionment in a de facto fashion. And so we can incorporate that into this sort of picture of relative abundance.
Chris Anderson.
A naive question on that definition. What is the distinction between spatial stock structure and, say, subject to localized depletion?
Yeah, one's.
I see a bunch of red on. I would tend to say that species with stock structure are more vulnerable to localized depletion. Sorry, Franz has his light on, Bob has his light on, and Curry is kind of raising his hand. We'll go to Curry. And Pat is actually talking without the microphone. So I think we're going to Curry.
I mean, to Chris's point, I mean,
Tell him he's on mute.
to flesh out that statement, one could say that, based on biological first principle, blah, 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 this is important to prevent localized depletion and ignore the sort of context surrounding kind of stock structure.
Yeah, I think that was my suggestion, that you state it in terms of the goal and not need to actually document that there's some sort of genetic stock structure.
Agreed.
All right, so it seems to me we've got that definition. At this point, it sounds like we're supporting supporting both method A and method B, or what? They're essentially.
It can't be.
Actually, we never came to a conclusion on whether or not the amount of information we have to set this flexibility is worth the time and the effort to go for method B. That was. So do we have any more discussion on that? Because I think that when we go up, we have to explain why we support both methods, and if they're not feasible, that's going to be key. Chris.
Guess I'm on a roll. So kind of listening to the discussion here, I think I like the flexibility spirit in method B, and in the sense that Kaylin was talking about, where the council can bring into under consideration a bunch of other things when there are lesser biological considerations. I'm a little bit puzzled as to why flexibility needs to be some formula of percentage as opposed to bounds, which is like how we do ABCs. But I like furthering exploration of flexibility.
Interesting.
Is your comment on that, Jason?
Comment. Yes, it is. Yeah.
Then Jason.
It is now. I guess my comment is I'm not understanding the advantage to having both A and B. If we're able to come up with some flexibility in B, then what does A provide at that point?
So totally with you. If you're doing B, A is an extreme where you add 0 to each. So it's either, so there's no flexibility if you add 0 to each, or you just specify literally an ABC under which the council has flexibility completely. So 100% flexibility is, so you're right. I think that the way I've been saying it is poor. But to answer, in response to Chris's, I too like flexibility. I do think that there is, both A and B give the council flexibility. A, either for a species, we determine whether we recommend sub-area allocations as sort of as we do now. And the council has chosen to set their tax under that. Or we can say we do not need to do sub-area allocations at all, because there is spatial structure, we do sub-area allocations. There's no spatial structure, we don't do any sub-area allocations. With no area allocations, the council can still, I believe, in my understanding, the council can still set sub-area tax, which is why the paper described that we can still let the council know what the proportion of biomass as our best estimate is in all 3 places, just as information for the council to set tax. It just doesn't set, it's just not a formal allocation. So I think it's just that, and your question for Chris, and wow, I hope we were able to write it better than this. The flexibility as a percentage or a bound, what we had described in the 2024 December minutes, it essentially, they were 3 bounds, but they didn't add up to 100%. So the count, yes. So you could call that a range or just taking the top of the range. We talked about it in both ways. I don't know if that helps. Yep, I got France and then I see Dana.
Yeah, just on the method A versus method B, I was, supporting the flexibility in method B, and I think method A is, in my mind, maybe not the best way, because it kind of assumes that the stock structure concerns, conservation concerns are kind of a binary. Either there is or there isn't. And I don't think that's the case. I mean, I know there's a range of stock structures from, salmon that go to one stream to, widely distributed species that has full connectivity. And I think method B is a way to kind of recognize that and deal with that.
And maybe Dana will address this. I think Curry and I were in full agreement on that. The question is, do you think that there is a way that we could do that if asked? Do we have the information in which to do that? So Dana is next, and then Curry.
Yeah, I had a little different view of A versus B, and the fact that A is, even though Sarah said it wasn't permanent, it would be one that would require some analysis to dissolve those boundaries. We've done this in the past. People would say, like, well, why do we have this boundary? We bring in some like stock structure stuff to look at that. And then whereas B, I think is more like, hey, there's a temporary problem. Let's have some flexibility to move things around. That's my distinction between the two.
Great. Thanks, Dana. Curry.
Yeah, I think I'm in full agreement that the flexibility under B seems warranted in this case. I think my concern as this becomes operationalized is that it can get complex very, very quick on a stock by stock basis. So it would behoove us to think about standardized ranges or bounds on that level of flexibility that are associated with both the biological concern, the amount of information we have available from the survey products that are before us for the stock, and set some default would be, I think, useful for us to consider, whether or not that needs to go into our minutes or not. I think one of the things that I hope we can, and again, I don't know if it needs to go into our minutes or our request to the plan teams and to authors, is that independent of where a stock falls across that spectrum from concern and information to no concern, it's still useful to have the apportionment metrics at our disposal. I can think of a situation where perhaps there's a stock for which we have limited concern based on our understanding of the stock structure, but all of a sudden the biomass from the survey drops very low in one particular area and we become incredibly worried about localized depletion. If we don't have that information at our disposal, we wouldn't know whether or not that stock needed to be elevated into a different category. So I think moving forward as a matter of practice, we want to ensure that that continues.
Great. And Dana, did you have another comment?
No, sorry.
All right. I will give my shot at a summary and yes, please add if necessary. We will acknowledge that sub-area ABCs are not ABCs. We will support a new acronym. We are going to speak to the two methods. We do support, and Dana, this is sort of under your definition, we support both method A and B. And A, which is our interpretation, would be, it would be it's sort of, it is an we would require an analysis to essentially get rid of sub areas for stocks that currently have them, and that would be a permanent thing. B, I think, is really what was meant here, and that was giving some flexibility for stocks for which there is not a conservation concern, but possibly some stock structure, having some flexibility in these ABCs. The SSC did not develop, in our discussion today, we didn't develop how to do a calculation or set that. We did say that it has to do with the degree of stock structure and movement. Let's see if I can get back up to my they are informed by the degree of movement and the range of a stock. I'm trying to go back here. We did define the purpose of a subarea or the benefit of a subarea from a scientific perspective. We had discussion of which stocks this would apply to, and we didn't come up with a list necessarily, but I believe where we landed was that it would be focused judiciously on non-target stocks. And let's see. We also, in our benefit of a subarea or definition of a subarea, will also account for acknowledge to the extent that we have what error is involved in that, what bias is involved in that. We will have a generic paragraph acknowledging, as far as socioeconomic information goes, that we still need to have the discussion that we didn't have in June, and recognize that this is a type of situation in which the council may want information to inform tax setting, and a conversation like this in the future could benefit that. We will also note that our understanding of, how's this, unless we receive more guidance from, we recognize that coming up with methods A and B are going to take some time. They're not going to be ready in time for the fall. Recognizing that SSC, our approach is that unless we receive additional guidance from the council, we will go forth and do science in line with their motion in December of this past year. And we will only delay or bring things up to the council through the spatial management policy if we are suggesting that we are going to combine subareas or make subareas smaller. Otherwise, if you change computer programs, if you change methodology, if you add an index in a survey, if you change your data, all of those things, we will go forth and do what we normally do and recommend the subarea apportionments or whatever they end up being called. All right. Yep, fronts.
Well, I'm just wondering if we do want to comment specifically on Shorttracker and Dusky, even if to just say that, as I think we suggested last year, we delayed 1 year and otherwise would sort of put in place the best estimate that the plan team brings forward this year.
Yeah, I think so. So for Shorttracker, which will come up, yes, we can use one or both examples and say, because I think we lined out in our December 2023 minutes that we normally would have added the long line survey to the trawl survey for apportionment from a biological perspective, but we had delayed for the council. And so at this point, going forth and doing science under the approach would mean adding the long line survey to the apportionment in the Gulf of Alaska for short rigger. And then I don't know off the top of my head, Dusky and Northerns, but yes. Okay. All right. Thank you, everybody. I'm hoping that this 6 minutes is within the error bars of a 4 o'clock. You have flexibility. Thank you. All right. Do you want? It is biased. It's always long. Ally, do you want to say anything about deadlines? We send them by email. Everybody know.
Yeah, I mean, everyone finally got my email, correct?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, maybe just reiterate that we need C1 and C2 by tomorrow morning. And I know that's tight. But strive. Thank you.
It is. And be in contact with Ally if there are issues with that. The other thing that I think Ally had asked me to, and council staff had mentioned the other time, is that I believe that the vessels viewing and gear demonstrations are from 4 to 7, drop in today. And if you wish. And if you want to know where, you need to ask somebody but me. Ian.
If anybody needs a ride, I have room for 4.
And Brad's got the address. Okay. Any other announcements that we need before? Thank you to everybody that survived this online. Miss you and appreciate your sacrifice. All right. Thanks all.
Thanks, Sherry.
Thanks, everyone.